Hi again everyone, and welcome to the video lecture 9 on the ASEAN Economic Community. There will be two seminars on the AEC. One, which is tracking the road up to the formation of the ASEAN Economic Community, and the next seminar, lecture 10, will be looking at the path forward pursuant to the establishment of the AEC. So what does the ASEAN Economic Community have in store for us? We know that there has been a lot of fanfare about the AEC. It is a critical pillar of the entire ASEAN community. We have seen in the past lectures on the political security and the sociocultural community, but we know that from the Eminent Persons Group report that the AEC is really the focus of ASEAN community building, right? And as we see in these headlines, that the ASEAN Economic Community is not only an aspiration formed during the time of the Eminent Persons Group and the formation of the ASEAN Charter, but also it is a real work in progress, right? ASEAN works towards innovation, Filipino youth to be ready for ASEAN, looking forward to greater integration in the ASEAN economic community. All these things are important because the economic development brought about by the integration in the ASEAN economic community is supposed to lift the region higher, become more competitive, and also to improve the lives of all ASEAN people. So these are further headlines of how ASEAN Economic Community is important to every ASEAN member state. So we all know that the ASEAN Economic Community is important, but what does it actually mean to do? What is it supposed to do? What is the ASEAN Economic Community? Is it supposed to deepen economic integration? Yes, but how? What does it mean? Does it mean to build a free trade area? Or does ASEAN want to become a customs union? What type of ASEAN economic community does ASEAN want to have? What does ASEAN want to do when it integrates economically? Because there are different theories and models of economic integration, and we need to understand what it is that ASEAN means to do and what ASEAN wants to become. There is also in the literature that ASEAN wants to be a single market and production base that is plugged into the global economy, right? There are the goals that we open up to our external partners, investments, we get the benefit of trade and greater investment, we get technical training when investors come in to build factories. Our human resources, our human capital is better trained, better equipped to work in, contemporary industries. When we have greater and freer trade, we are eliminating trade barriers as well. So, all increasingly economic barriers are removed and ASEAN member states can flourish and ASEAN region as a whole will flourish. What are the other economic goals? Because economic integration is a very complex and a very large program. So what types of goals is ASEAN going to prioritize? Because we cannot do everything at once, right? Are we looking at free trade in goods? Are we looking at free trade in investments? Free trade in services? Are we looking to get greater investment? Are we trying to, look at greater movement of capital? Are we comparing ourselves to NAFTA and the EU? What type of economic community are we trying to become, right? And then apart from the economic community of ASEAN, how are we going to get to our end goal? What type of instruments are we using? Are we using treaties? Are we using soft laws? Are we using conventions, blueprints? What are these instruments, and what do these ASEAN economic instruments actually contain, right? And as we know that ASEAN wants to become a community, a rules-based community, so law is important, but the institutions that regulate, implement, and enforce the law are also important. So what institutions are we looking at when the ASEAN Economic Community is concerned? We're looking at, the ASEAN Secretariat, the ASEAN Economic Ministerial Meeting, the ASEAN Economic Senior Officials Meeting, the Monitoring and Evaluation Unit in the ASEAN Secretariat. We're also looking at, the ASEAN Economic Community Scorecard, which is now superseded by the Monitoring and Evaluation Reporting Mechanism. In the ASEAN Economic Community, when there are disputes, what are we looking at to resolve these disputes? So we also need to return to the dispute settlement mechanisms that we saw in lecture video 5, right? And of course, economic development is not just for ASEAN member states, it's not just for the MNCs, it's not for the big industries only. Increasingly in the psyche of ASEAN ministers and ASEAN powers, there is at the agenda the notion of equitable development. So it's not only when we get economic development that the states and multinational corporations gain, but ordinary people, citizens like you and me, we should gain the profits and also the benefits of economic community building. So going back to what I said in the beginning, that this video lecture is really looking at the development of ASEAN economic cooperation moving up to the ASEAN Charter. So let's see how this notion of ASEAN economic cooperation and integration began. The first phase was in the 1970s to the mid-1990s, and we saw this as expressed in the Bali Concord 1, where relations had stabilized enough to build the ASEAN Secretariat and also to knit together greater projects for economic cooperation, right? And in this first phase of economic cooperation, we see two tracks, investment, right, and trade. And of course, investment is very, very important because in the 60s and 70s, or in the post-war years, ASEAN member states were, in great need of economic development. And if we could not generate this economic development on our own, we need to attract foreign money, foreign capital, foreign investment to build up our industries, our local industries, so that we are in a better position to, grow economically and also produce goods to trade with the rest of the world, right? So a key point in the early stage of economic cooperation was investment. We need to attract foreign direct investment, FDI. So there was greater investment through industrial project scheme, right? That it was large-scale, capital-intensive ventures, but out of each member state, even though each member state had one venture, only 2 eventually operated. And there was also the ASEAN Industrial Complementation Scheme and the ASEAN Industrial Joint Ventures. All these were external partnerships and private sector driven, right? Because since we did not have enough capital at the level of ASEAN member states, we needed to attract foreign capital investment so that we can start up our own industries. Apart from investment, we were also looking in this first phase freer trade through preferential trading agreements, right? And it was not large scale. It was really through a product by product basis. And the tariff rates were given, preferential tariff rates were given for products that were produced locally, right, within the ASEAN region, but to qualify for the better tariff rates, these products needed to have more than 50% of local content. And of course, there was a sensitive list of, protected goods, right? And it was a very long list of protected goods. So even though we were working towards lowering trade barriers through preferential trading agreements, there was a very long sensitive list which precluded many goods from enjoying the preferential trading status. So why did this first phase, 70s up to the 1990s, why did this first trade and investment phase fail? Well, mainly on the trade side, there were many difficulties. There were many indecisions on what type of product to cooperate on. There was also a lack of guidelines and clear goals for trade and investment. Obviously, there was a lack of resources, right? For the shared trade investment schemes, the host state, the ASEAN member state, needed to raise 60% costs. And if we are, low developing countries, it would be very difficult to raise so many monies, right, to raise the capital. And at that point in time, the private sector was seen as uncooperative, or they were not fully cooperated into the schemes by the ASEAN member states. There was also a lot of bureaucratic procedure, corruption, red tape, which slowed down all these ventures. And at that point in time, in the 70s to the 1990s, there was a real domestic focus. Instead of, freeing up the region, the entire region, on better trade and investment, ASEAN member states were more unilateral in outlook. There was this domestic focus on national resilience, right? So each member state would want to develop better trading ties with external partners rather than to build regional trading ties with the rest of the world. So the focus really was on themselves, right? If you want to have better trade, that member state would have better trade with the rest of the world. If you want to have better investment, that ASEAN member state would have more investment than, the rest of the ASEAN members. It was a competitive basis for trade and investment with the other ASEAN member states, in a manner of speaking, right? And then, of course, if we're talking about the ASEAN trade area, there was a priority of world trade more than intra-ASEAN trade. If you think about it, especially in the 70s to the 90s, our natural resources, the goods we produce, are very, very similar, right? So there's so much competition. Why should we, or how can we even trade among ourselves? We are producing similar goods. So the priority of world trade is that we trade with the rest of the world. Since the 70s to 1990s, the first phase didn't work so well. We tried to improve the second phase of economic cooperation in the 1990s. Again, it's a dual track, trade and investment. But in the 1990s, we see that trade seems to come more to the forefront than investment. Investment is always there, attracting foreign investment, but trade has a bigger emphasis now, right? So in the 1990s, ASEAN needed to be greater as a trading bloc. It needs to be more resilient, and ASEAN member states saw the merit of strength in size and numbers. So they signed this treaty, the 1992 Agreement on the Common Effective Preferential Tariff Scheme for the ASEAN Free Trade Area, the CEPT for after, right? And so in 1992, the idea to form an ASEAN Free Trade Area was formed. by the mid 2000s, the ASEAN Free Trade Area was formally established, but it is really quite unclear as to the exact date of the formation of the ASEAN Free Trade Area. You can see that the initial date was 2008, then it got moved down to 2003, and to 2002 for the first ASEAN member 6 members, and the CLMV could join up later. What this CEPT for after did was to remove trade barriers at a faster rate, and so they took a sectoral approach rather than a goods or a product by product approach. They also wanted to ramp up intra-regional trade through increasing business efficiency and effectiveness. But at the end of the day, even with such lofty aspirations, the exclusion lists still remained very strongly, right? So there was the temporary exclusion list, such as for those ASEAN member states that were not ready to slash tariffs. There was also the sensitive list, such as for agricultural products, like for rice, grains, and so on and so forth. And we all know that agricultural products are a very sensitive kind of list of products, right? So it's not only for ASEAN, but around the world. There are many subsidies for agricultural products. And then there are also general exceptions to, lowering the trading barriers. So the general exception list would be that, goods that could impact on national security, morals, health, so on and so forth, would not be given the preferential trading rate. And all these exclusions and barriers added up and still, retarded and impeded the development of the ASEAN Free Trade Area according to the CEPT. During the 1990s, because ASEAN economic cooperation really accelerated, in addition to the CEPT after, ASEAN member states also signed the treaty to increase free trade in services, the 1995 ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services. Investment also was important during the 1990s, and so after the CEPT after and the Services Treaty, ASEAN member states signed the 1998 Framework Agreement on the ASEAN Investment Area. So it's to make the entire region an investment area attractive to foreign direct investors. So the specific areas that they were looking at were industrial production, procurement, manufacturing, resources-based investments. So resources like oil, gas, so on and so forth, natural resources, right? That these big companies will invest in ASEAN member states and pour in money and train up our people, and then we develop and we have goods to trade with the rest of the world. There was the ASEAN Industrial Cooperation Scheme. This superseded the failed initiatives in the 1970s on the industrial investment initiatives. There was an adjustment of the policy. So two companies from two countries, they would get preferential tariffs and also preferential access to participating countries' markets. The types of industries they were looking at were automobiles, automotive like scooters, electronics, and we understand that many ASEAN member states are producing electronics, including Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam. Food processing industries, very big industries in now we see today in Thailand, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and Vietnam, right? But in the 1990s, these industrial investment schemes, again, were not so successful. They were more successful than the 1970s and 80s schemes, but still not very successful because of the restriction networks and other obstacles. So now let's take a collective view on why ASEAN cooperation in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was so difficult, right? In all three phases, or in all two phases, we see that there was deliberate protectionism. Member states were not willing to lower their tariff barriers, right? And their exclusion lists or sensitive lists were still very, very long. Part of this was, they didn't want to lose sovereignty in setting, lowering their national tariff policies. There would also be a loss in income if they lowered, to the common tariff rate. In terms of free movement of labor, free movement of services, it is still very difficult because labor is a sensitive issue. Labor markets remain protected. And then, of course, in terms of sovereignty and national outlook, yes, we want to grow together economically as a region. We want to cooperate economically. But all the ASEAN member states would have their own trade and investment policies, right? They have bilateral, plurilateral trade agreements, so on and so forth, or multilateral trade agreements. And this national policy would sometimes, impede or interfere with the regional economic outlook. Nonetheless, to create an ASEAN free trade area is still a net positive. That would be an increase in regional trade and also trade from the region with the rest of the world, right? And therefore, even if there are pros and cons to setting up the ASEAN free trade area, there is a net positive, and so ASEAN member states are still pushing for, and to develop the ASEAN free trade area further. Another obstacle to, developing or getting the ASEAN free trade area and developing it further is because of the weak rule of law and institutions, low compliance. We saw in previous videos or video lectures that the pre-2007 compliance rate with ASEAN instruments was only 30%, around 30%. And if we have so many laws, but they are not implemented, not complied with, of course, it is very difficult to see the actual result of the laws and institutions that we establish, right? And as we cooperate, we are going to meet frictions, we're going to have disputes, but we don't use enough of our dispute settlement mechanisms, and sometimes our dispute settlement mechanisms are not robust enough. There is also a lack of monitoring, as we have seen as well, in addition to the lack of dispute settlement mechanisms. And sometimes there could be also a very cavalier attitude to violations of the treaties, the economic treaties, right? And there's a constant change of deadlines. So we can see, and of course, if the deadlines keep changing, countries cannot move fast enough. We saw after 2008, moved down to 2003, or 2006, moved down to 2003, moved down to 2002. We can change deadlines easily, but we cannot change our national capacities and resources that easily. So when we keep changing deadlines, it is not so easy to actually execute to meet the deadlines that we have set, right? And sometimes external people say this, external observers say that we do not have, or ASEAN does not have supranational institutions or enforceable community law to make sure that ASEAN economic cooperation actually gets implemented. To some extent, there is some truth, but we will see as this lecture continues and as this seminar continues over seminar 9 and seminar 10, that the lack of supranationalism is not an impediment to the establishment and flourishing of the ASEAN economic community. Because ASEAN does have economic treaties and they are enforceable, we do not have supranational institutions, but we will have alternative mechanisms, right? But obviously most of our investors are foreign investors, and if they see that there is a lack of supranational institutions and a lack of enforceable, ASEAN economic law, then this would undermine investor confidence. We can see, right, as we said, pre-2007, the ASEAN compliance rate was about 30%. And you can see that it was not for a lack of ASEAN economic treaties. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, there were so many ASEAN economic instruments, especially ASEAN economic treaties. And how can it be that these treaties were not complied with, right? There was political will to adopt these treaties, but there was not enough political will to implement, execute, and to comply with these. Because of the lackluster economic cooperation in the 70s up to the late 1990s, we see the third phase of ASEAN economic cooperation in the 2000s, right? Now in the early 2000s, there was, on the back of the Asian financial crisis, dot-com bust, so on and so forth, ASEAN's economy was more precarious than ever. And ASEAN member states, all 10 member states, saw that it was very, very important for them to unite, to cooperate economically so that they could compete with the rest of the world, so that they could be plugged into the global economy, right? So in the Bali Concord 2 of 2003, the ASEAN Economic Community was first envisioned, and it was defined alongside the first and the third pillar. As we saw in the Eminent Persons Group report, the rise of China and India in the 2000s also made ASEAN wary of losing its relevance in the world stage, in the world order, and in the world economy. Also, towards the end of the 1990s, the Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam joined up to ASEAN, and the CLMV countries are very focused on economic development, and all these pressures within ASEAN heightened the awareness that they needed to cooperate economically. So now what ASEAN wants is to develop economically for every ASEAN member states and to develop economically for the entire region. They want to develop through the ASEAN Economic Community a bigger market and production base for the world, right? So a bigger market to trade in, and also a bigger production base that we produce goods to trade with the rest of the world. And apart from that, the ASEAN Economic Community will bring about greater intra-ASEAN trade. So, we trade with one another, we have more differentiated goods, we trade with one another, and we benefit from the economic relations that we deal with one another. And why is all this so important? Because ASEAN is seen as a young region with a very sizable population, right? So this is 2012 data, and but the population sizes are more or less the same. And you can see that with 608 million or so people in ASEAN, and most of them are young people, ASEAN is in a position to grow and is very attractive to the world investors. In terms of, market, ASEAN with 608 million people as combined is competitive and comparable to the rest of, the large markets in the world economic order. You can see how if we form the ASEAN Economic Community, we would be able to compete with Japan, the US, EU, and obviously India and China, which are very, very large markets. In terms of the output, where is the economic development? Where's the economic benefit to our countries? So when the ASEAN Economic Community is combined, it is projected to have $2.3 trillion in GDP, and this would put it competitively alongside India, Japan, China, as well as the US and EU. To give you a snapshot of the ASEAN economies, these are the 10 ASEAN member states. The 6 largest ASEAN economies make up for 95% of the ASEAN GDP. So you can see the great disparity among the ASEAN member states in terms of national or gross domestic product, but this also shows us the potential for growth in the combined ASEAN economy. There is so much room to grow, especially for Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. Vietnam has already grown tremendously and is, I think, as of this year, the 4th largest economy in ASEAN. This is also another snapshot of the economic development of ASEAN member states. This is also why the formation of ASEAN Economic Community is so important to every ASEAN member state. It's because of the disparity in the economic development. ASEAN member states all want to develop nationally, and the ASEAN Economic Community, when formed and developed, will bring about greater opportunities for ASEAN member states to develop. So now the ASEAN Economic Community is already established at the end of 2015. We are looking at greater growth and the fulfillment of national potentials. Another chart on the real GDP growth in Southeast Asia as compared to China and India. And this is really quite interesting, right? You can see emerging ASEAN, emerging Asia, how it compares with China and India. So there is room to grow. So now we are moving towards the ASEAN Economic Community from the 2000s Bali Concord towards the ASEAN Charter. So before we sign the ASEAN Charter, let's try to understand what ASEAN member states want from the ASEAN Economic Community as enunciated in the 2003 Bali Concord, right? As we saw, and now it is here clearly stated, ASEAN member states want the ASEAN Economic Community to be a bloc, a free trade bloc that has a free flow of goods, services, investment, and it wants to have a freer flow of capital. It wants to have better equitable economic development, right? So not just economic development, but equitable, right? That impacts on the lives of ordinary people so that it can reduce poverty and socio-economic disparities in year 2020. So that was the aspiration in 2003. There are 3 prongs of free in the Bali Concord tool: free trade in goods, free trade in services, and freer investment flows. There's also freer flow of capital for the financial markets and services, so the banking and finance sectors. And we also need to emphasize the equitable development and greater development for the CLMV countries. Now we move forward. The ASEAN Economic Community, right, shall establish ASEAN as a single market and production base. It needs to be more dynamic, bring greater business opportunities, and our industries can plug into the global supply chain. So there is more external as well as intra-ASEAN trade. There should be less fragmentation if we cohere into a cohesive economic bloc, and there will be lower differentiated costs. So there will be lower costs and more uniform lower costs, right? So greater efficiency, more cost effectiveness, and this will enable us to fit into global markets and global value chains, and to make sure that we move towards the ASEAN Economic Community. In the 2000s, ASEAN member states said that we need to have a high-level task force on ASEAN economic integration. What other things did we need to put in place to move towards the ASEAN Economic Community? We see that ASEAN shall institute new mechanisms, should strengthen the implementation of existing economic initiatives such as AFTA, ARTIGA, the Framework Agreement on Services, and the ASEAN Investment Area. So they wanted to move towards zero tariffs. They wanted to simplify customs procedures so that goods can move through customs faster. We need to bring up our free trade area to WTO standards, right? Because by then, all ASEAN member states were WTO members, and so as a very baseline, we would have free trade and free movement of goods, free trade in line with WTO standards. There was also the push towards using ASEAN minus X and the acceleration of priority sectors, and also to increase the movement of skilled labor such as business persons, professionals, so on and so forth, right? Priority sectors of trade and investment are listed as wood-based products, automotives as we see, that's not changed, rubber-based products, textiles and apparels, and we can see that 1, 2, 3, and 4 are products which are produced very much in the ASEAN region. Obviously, agricultural products, fisheries, right? Fishing in the South China Sea, electronics, as I mentioned before, e-commerce in ASEAN, e-ASEAN, electronic ASEAN, so that we have moved towards digitalization. Healthcare is important, right? And there's also health tourism in the ASEAN region, especially for Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand. Air travel is a very, very big priority area. Well, pre-pandemic times, right? Air travel. Many major air carriers of the world pass through the ASEAN region. And of course, tourism. These are the listed priority areas. Apart from these priority areas and laws and institutions, they also highlighted that we need to strengthen institutional mechanisms and move into improving ASEAN dispute settlements, right? So that this can bring about better ASEAN economic integration. Policy issues should be managed by the ASEAN Economic Ministerial Meeting, technical issues to be resolved by the senior economic officials meetings, and then they even advocated a legal unit within the ASEAN Secretariat to provide legal advice on trade disputes, right? And then there was also the initiative to have an ASEAN consultation to resolve trade and investment issues at the policy level or on a day-to-day, on-the-go level. To increase compliance, they wanted to establish the ASEAN compliance body, right? And then also to enhance dispute settlement mechanisms. But they also flagged that in the first instance, we need consultation, dialogue, mediation, and conciliation. In addition, there are many measures that need to be taken to enhance ASEAN economic cooperation. This would increase liberalization and cooperation among ASEAN member states. We need to improve human resources, educational qualifications of ASEAN people so that they can move into the growing industries and more sophisticated industries. We need to ramp up macroeconomic and financial policies, trade policies, and infrastructure and communications, as well as to enhance private segment, right? So there are many things involved in the building of the ASEAN economic community to improve ASEAN economic cooperation, to improve ASEAN economic integration. So to recap, let's look at the issues in ASEAN economic integration. What do we want? What does ASEAN want the economic community to be? Does it want to be like the EU, or does ASEAN want to be sui generis, right? And to understand what ASEAN wants out of its ASEAN economic community, we need to take note of the issues like free flow, single market, production-based, equitable development. What do these definitions mean? For freer flow of trade, we need to lower tariff barriers, we need to lower non-tariff measures, we need to get rid of the hidden barriers, we need to eradicate corruption as well as administrative inefficiencies. We need to ramp up freer flow of services and investments. But how would these come about, right? We want to have freer flow of capital and financial markets. How then do we free up these pathways and make ourselves more efficient, right? So, and how do we, make sure that we have trickle-down effects or more equitable development? All in all, ASEAN seems to want to become a sui generis model. We need to understand what it wants to be and the methods it needs to take to get to where it wants to reach at the end goal of the ASEAN economic community. A last point on wealth inequality and equitable development. This is very important. Why equitable development is important? Because there's wealth inequality. So once we have greater economic development that is equitable, this would mean that wealth inequality differences would be narrowed. So everybody gets a slice of the pie.